we'll get started. We seem to have quite a lot of people here right now. So most of you know me already. My name is Lynn Ross, and I'm on the Arts and Culture Committee with Helene Isaacs, and we work under Heidi. And this is our last program for the year. But there is another program coming up that is with the Great Mind Salon. And it's Debbie Yaffe on May 20th. She's doing a program, Jane Austen, Superstar, from classic author to pop cult phenom. So if you're interested in that, you should definitely sign up for it. But
also, I'll interject, Lynn. I just saw an email today. It's not through Arts and Culture, but there's a program on May 12th about food insecurity. And Beth Anglesos from JFCS is going to be speaking. So mark your calendars if you're interested.
Okay, that's interesting. And it ties in really tightly with what we're doing here today. So we've had a great year. We've done a lot of things. It's been fun. It's been a lot of work. And we thank you all for coming to this and all the other events. And also for all the people who presented and members of our community and our congregation who, you know, had something to share and shared with us. It was really, really great. Over the course of this year, we had a lot of programs, and sometimes there was a connection just to other members of our community, something that we all needed, and sometimes where the content was more specifically Jewish. And Mike Rosenthal brought us this program, but Mike's computer is kaplooey, and he's on using his phone right now, so he asked me to take over as moderator for him. And he brought us this program idea, and he introduced us to Margaret Pickoff, who is going to be presenting tonight. Mike suggested this program, and he made a connection to Judaism, and we had a conversation about this earlier today when he called to tell me about his computer. And he thought he made the connections because he was saying that growing things and caring for the earth provide us a way to experience God's creations. And we acknowledge this when we say a bracha before we eat fruit or vegetables or any of the food at our table. So I wanted to bring that to the conversation. Margaret is also I'm going to read this. Margaret is the county horticulturist for the Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Mercer County, where she delivers educational programming on home horticulture and coordinates the Rutgers Master Gardener and Rutgers Environmental Stewards Program. She holds a Master of Science degree in Plant, Soil, and Environmental Sciences from the University of Maine, specializing in organic crop production and soil fertility. She developed her interest in plants and land stewardship while working on small farms and in community gardens in New Jersey, Maine, and Washington State. Margaret loves growing vegetables, flowers, and herbs in her community garden plot, and I'm sure we will all be beneficiaries of her great knowledge in terms of what we eat over the summer. So thank you, Margaret. Here you go.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And I want to thank Mike for connecting me to the Jewish Center. Mike and I have become friends over the last year. We're neighbors here in Princeton, and so I'm so happy to be delivering this program for the Jewish Center. I do recognize a couple of names from various classes and programs that I'm a part of through my work, so I'm glad that you're here.
I want to interrupt for 1 second. Margaret asked that we hold questions to the end, so I did want to say that. Sorry, yes. Margaret, go on.
No problem. So I'm going to share my screen. I have PowerPoint slides to share with you. How does that look? Is that in full screen mode?
Yes.
Okay, looks good. All right, so I'm just going to jump right in. This is a talk that I often get asked to present on, and so I encourage you to look us up. A lot of people don't know about the Extension Service, and it's a really important service in our community. The other thing I just wanted to point out before we get going, gardening is a huge topic to talk about, and whenever I give a talk, there are always questions about things beyond the topic of the evening. And so I did want to draw your attention to the Rutgers Home Lawn and Garden homepage, which is a great place to start if you have a specific question about lawns or native plants or how to garden with your kids. Lots of fact sheets, videos, lots of really great resources on this website. And I can share these links for you at the end of the program, so you don't have to copy them down now. But I did just want to draw your attention to that as well as a resource going forward. Okay, so I mentioned that container gardening is very versatile. There are lots of different types of containers that you can put around the home. I will talk a little bit about what the needs are for growing vegetables in terms of sunlight and water and soil conditions, but these are just some examples of different types of containers. So we have window planters, which are usually used to grow ornamental plants, annual flowering plants, like you see on the left-hand side. But they, if you don't have any ground space, you don't have steps or a balcony or anything, a window planter is a great place to start for flowers and herbs and many vegetables. Hanging baskets can be nice because they're a little bit ornamental as well. And they're a great way to save space. So again, you don't have a lot of space for containers to be on the ground, hanging basket is a nice option. And these are some nice ones. I really like how these tomatoes kind of hang over the side. They have a nice ornamental effect. And usually the sides of these containers are porous or open, but they're lined with some sort of natural material like coconut coir, as you see in this photo on the right-hand side. Containers can be small or large, and that is going to depend on your personal preference, the amount of space that you have, and also the type of crop that you want to grow. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but these kind of larger barrels are good for larger crops like eggplants, whereas smaller containers can be used for herbs, flowers, and smaller rooted crops. And then I wanted to point out that you don't have to go to the store to purchase a specific container that is created, for the purpose of growing food. You can use pretty much any type of container as long as it has drainage holes at the bottom and as long as it's clean. Plastic totes are a popular vessel for growing container vegetables, as you can see here. These 5-gallon buckets that you can get at Home Depot. So there's really no need to spend a lot of money on a fancy container unless that is something you want to do. There are some really nice ornamental, beautiful containers that you can purchase, but this can definitely be done on a budget as well, as you can see here. Similarly, these are just, plastic totes. As long as you drill some drainage holes in the bottom, you are pretty much good to go. And these can hold a lot of soil, so they can support some of our larger crops. Again, these are eggplants and peppers can do really nicely in those big plastic totes. They also have handles, so we'll talk a little bit about, these containers do get rather heavy, but they are, one advantage is you can actually move them around, unlike a regular in-ground vegetable garden. So that can be a plus as well. Raised beds are a type of container planting, even though they're kind of a little bit more towards the traditional garden bed style. Raised beds are really handy if you have really poor soil, if your soil is really rocky, maybe you're concerned about nutrients or the pH of the soil, and rather than adding a bunch of soil amendments to try to change that, you can build a raised bed on top of your native soil and fill it with whatever nice garden soil you want to. These tend to drain faster than in-ground gardens, and they also lift the garden up a foot or so. So if you are somebody who has a hard time getting on your hands and knees to do weeding or other garden maintenance, a raised bed can sort of lift the production up a little bit. And you can use raised beds to grow pretty much anything that you can grow in the ground. So that's a nice container option if you do have a little bit more space on your property. We also see different types of raised beds and containers used to make gardening more accessible to people with physical disabilities. And so there, if you go to healing gardens or places that specialize in having gardening activities for folks with physical disabilities, it's another type of versatile gardening. So somebody who would have a hard time getting on the ground and doing the work of gardening could have, again, in this sort of raised bed fashion, could have a bed that is wheelchair accessible, for example. So that's another sort of scaled up version of container planting that I want to call attention to, because this type of gardening, again, can be used to match any sort of ability or disability that's needed. So let's talk a little bit about planting conditions for vegetables. And these are pretty similar to planting conditions for annual flowers and herbs. So once you have these down, you can grow all sorts of crops in your garden. So most vegetable crops will require full sun, which is between 6 and 8 hours of sun per day. It's also best if you have the choice to site the garden in a place where there isn't a lot of wind. And that's for a couple of reasons, one of which is maybe obvious that, you know, if you have tall tomatoes or you have tomato cages or trellises that beans or peas are growing up, the windier it is, the more likely that those structures are going to be blown over. But also wind going through the garden will wick moisture away from the plant leaves and the soil surface. So you're going to find that the area will dry out much faster and you'll have to water more often. So it's generally less stressful for the plants if they're in a protected area that isn't very windy. Another thing is fertile, well-drained soil. One advantage of container gardening is that you're not using soil from the garden or the ground. You're actually creating a special mixture that is perfect and nice and light and fluffy for a container. So generally you don't have to worry too much about this part. You don't have to get your soil tested. You don't have to go through you know, how much fertilizer do I have to add? How much lime do I have to add to raise the soil pH? That sort of thing that you do have to really pay attention to with an in-ground garden. And last is just proximity to a water source. And this, you know, with container gardens, it's usually easy to place the containers close to a hose bib or even next to your kitchen so that you can water from the sink. But it goes without saying that the further you are from your water source, the less fun it will be to water your plants. And so probably you won't end up doing it quite enough and your plants will suffer. So make it easy for yourself. Put the garden close to your hose or wherever you're going to get your water. And culinary herbs, I mentioned, have a lot of the same needs as many vegetable crops. Most of the common culinary herbs need a lot of sun, especially the ones that we associate with the Mediterranean, like oregano, sage, a lot of those great culinary herbs. They like a little bit drier soil, so it's got to be soil that drains really well, which works very well in containers. And as much sun as you can give them is usually the best. So it's always good before you start any type of garden project to assess the light conditions around your home. If you just moved into a new property or a new apartment, it's good to just spend a day observing where the sun moves on your property, and at different times of year as well, because as we know, in the past couple of weeks, all of our big trees are starting to leaf out, and that will change the sunlight conditions. So what may have been a sunny backyard in the winter kind of becomes one that has dappled shade. So again, most vegetable crops need full sun, so at least 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight per day. There are some veggies that don't mind partial sun, so 4 to 6 hours. No vegetable is going to grow in shade, so you shouldn't even try. They're not going to do very well. If you have a lot of shade around your property, you might be better off planting some of the plants on the right-hand side photo, like hostas, perennial plants that are grown for their beautiful foliage. Those are not the best conditions for growing veggies. So if your backyard looks like this, that's a beautiful backyard for a nice perennial shade garden, but not a lot of space there to site a vegetable garden. I could kind of see on this left-hand photo, there's a little bit of sun here. You could stick a couple of containers there, but in general, you're going to struggle trying to grow lots of vegetables in these conditions. So if the sunniest part of your home is a balcony or a patio, that's a great place to put some containers as well. And then you have the added bonus of, there are not going to be any deer up 2 flights of stairs on the second floor balcony, so you don't have to worry about that as much. So I mentioned different vegetables have slightly different light requirements. Any vegetable is going to be happy with full sun. Leafy greens like spinach and lettuce and arugula, they don't need quite as much sun, so 4 to 5 hours of direct sunlight is usually okay. If you've grown lettuce before, you know that it doesn't really like the heat of the summer. It will start to bolt and the leaves will get really bitter. And so they actually prefer to be a little bit less direct sun and heat. So if you have a little bit more shade, you can still grow some of these leafy greens. Root vegetables like beets and carrots need about 5 to 6 hours of direct sunlight. And then the fruiting vegetables like eggplants and tomatoes and peppers and squash need the most amount of sun. They're putting a lot of energy into creating these fruits that we then harvest. And so they need as much sun as we can give them. Most vegetables will tolerate being planted in containers. It's just a matter of knowing how large their root system is and what size pot you need in order to match that root system. So again, leafy greens and herbs have a smaller root system. Their roots don't go down very far, so they can be planted in a 4 to 6 inch deep pot. So that's your lettuce, your chard, mustard, some kale. Your root vegetables, you do need a slightly deeper pot for that because they're growing, downward into the soil. So about 8 to 12 inches deep is good for those. And then again, the largest vegetables that are producing fruits that might get a little bit heavier usually need at least 12 inches deep. And you want about 1 plant per pot because they can get fairly large. So even if they look really small and cute at the beginning of the growing season, these types of plants get very large and sprawl out. So they need a larger pot, and generally they want to be in the pot by themselves. So just some examples, we have lettuce growing here, and that's not a very deep container, and that's totally fine. Lettuce grows very quickly, like a lot of leafy greens, and so you could probably even get a couple of successions of these types of crops, and you don't need a very light, deep container. Whereas your tomatoes and eggplants, they need a larger container. Another thing you want to consider is that if these plants get very large and produce these big eggplants or tomatoes, they're going to get a little top heavy. So it's important to have a container that can hold enough soil. So not only do their roots have plenty of room, but the pot itself will support a pretty top heavy plant. There are some vegetables that really don't tolerate containers, and maybe these are obvious, but things like watermelon, I wouldn't try to grow in a container. unless you could find a really small dwarf variety. But things that have large vines and heavy fruit generally are not going to be your best container vegetables or fruits. And then something like corn, which is very tall and prone to toppling over. I have seen it grown in raised beds, but for a smaller pot or container, I think it would just kind of flop over. So those might not be the best crops to go with, but almost everything else can be grown in containers. So I just wanted to point out, we are well within the spring season at this point, but you may just be starting to think about the garden now. If you're in the gardening world, year round, like I am, we start thinking about the garden in like January. That's when I order my seed catalogs and I start daydreaming about my summer garden. But if you're just getting into it now, a nice way to figure out what you want to plant, besides asking yourself, what do you want to be harvesting in a couple of months, is order some seed catalogs. Many seed companies will offer free catalogs. They'll mail them right to your door. A lot of them have really nice color photos, and so you can kind of get a sense of what's out there, what varieties there are, and what looks good to you. Since the pandemic started, we have been seeing some shortages of vegetable seeds because so many people have started gardening over this past year, which is great, but it might take a little bit of digging to find seeds at places that normally wouldn't have a shortage like that. So it's kind of a good thing and a bad thing. There are lots of crop varieties out there, and that can be a little bit confusing for a new gardener. And so when you're thinking about what variety of crop you should be growing, like tomatoes, there are just hundreds of varieties. So how do you know where to start? I would encourage you to look at some cooperative extension fact sheets, which are viewable online for free. You can download them and print them out. They're completely free to you. And they've got really good information about not only what variety to choose, but also about what planting site you need, what kind of soil preparation you need for different types of plants. So obviously here in New Jersey, everybody likes growing tomatoes. And so we at Rutgers, we have a great fact sheet on growing tomatoes, which walks you through variety selection and all sorts of really good information. So that would be the first place I'd start. Besides just talking to fellow gardeners, maybe some of your neighbors are gardeners and they have their favorite varieties. Sometimes you'll get some free plants from them too, which is a nice bonus. There are certain varieties that are recommended for growing in containers. And these tend to be varieties that they're labeled dwarf variety or a bush variety. That just means that the plant is it is grown to be a little bit smaller and more compact, and that's kind of a part of the breeding process. And so again, this is just a screenshot from a fact sheet from Texas A&M Extension, but they go over some kind of smaller, more compact varieties for containers. Which is helpful, so the plants won't topple over because they won't get quite as large. So for example, they give some recommendations for cucumbers that are maybe a little bit smaller and more compact. And they'll also tell you how large of a container you need for that particular plant. So fact sheets, extension fact sheets are a really great place to go. There's a lot of gardening blogs out there that are written by all sorts of people with all sorts of experiences. You just want to be careful to find information that you can trust, that's backed by research, and extension resources are a good place to start for that. So I want to talk a little bit about timing of planting, because we are getting to the point where we're not expecting any more frost in our region. And so our plant hardiness zone here in New Jersey, we have between 6A and 7B. And if you're not familiar, the plant hardiness zones are determined by the USDA. They are based on 30 years of minimum temperature data. So it's kind of just an easy way of looking at the map and seeing what the growing seasons are like in a specific region. So here in Mercer County, we are kind of straddling zone 6B and 7A. And so for us, our average frost-free date is April 26th. So that is on average the time when you can expect to plant things outside that don't tolerate frost very well. Occasionally we'll get a really cold day like we had, I don't know if that was last week or the week before, it got really, really cold again. But on average, this is the date to go by. So we're kind of out of the woods at this point. We used to recommend Mother's Day as the time that you can safely plant outside without fearing the frost, but with climate change, that date is moving up a little bit for us here in New Jersey. So this is a planting chart for zone 7A, and it just gives you a rough outline of what crops can be planted at what time of year. And this is based on the fact that certain crops will enjoy hot, dry weather, like the middle of the summer, and some crops do not like that at all, and prefer to be planted in the shoulder seasons of spring and fall. So lettuce is a good example of that. It's hard to grow lettuce in the middle of the summer in New Jersey, but you can get multiple successions of lettuce in the spring and then plant again in the fall. But something like tomatoes love hot, dry weather, and so they do really well in the middle of the summer. The other thing to know is that some crops are hardy and some are tender. So the hardy crops are ones that they will tolerate a little bit of frost. They don't mind the cooler temperatures, and they actually do pretty well when it's a little bit cooler. And so these are some crops that you may be able to plant out pretty early. Some gardeners will plant their peas on St. Patrick's Day in the middle of March. And a lot of these tend to be faster growing crops as well. So you can get 1 or 2 successions of these in the springtime before it gets really hot. The tender crops are ones that do not tolerate any frost at all. So they will either die or just really slow their production when it starts getting colder. So it's really important not to plant your tomatoes or your peppers outside when it's still cold out, because they're not gonna like that cold weather. And there are some really good digital tools online for determining when you should be planting outside based on our hardiness zones. This is my favorite because it's just really easy to use. It is a seed starting and planting calendar from awaytogarden.com, which, if you know Margaret Roach, she's a garden writer. She writes for the New York Times every week. She has a garden column. This is her website, and she just has this really simple tool for figuring out when you should be starting your seeds indoors and when you can plant outside. So what you do is just put in your final spring frost date here. And so this is a conservative estimate. This is May 10th, which again, our average is probably more like April 26th here. And then you press calculate, and it will populate the table with all this information so that you know for each crop when you can start to plant outside, if you want to start seeds indoors, when you should be starting them indoors, because it's a lot of information to kind of take in, especially for new gardeners. So I recommend a tool like this that kind of does all the heavy lifting for you. So preparing a container. So you've figured out what you want to plant. You have your container, you know what size it's supposed to be. So the first step is making sure that it's the correct size, that it's large enough or small enough to fit in the space that you have, and that it's going to accommodate the type of plant that you want to grow. second step, I guess, is cleaning and sanitizing the container. Really only if it's a used container, if you're using it year after year. With a bleach solution, usually 1 part bleach to 9 or 10 parts water is a nice solution for sanitizing pots and tools from the garden. And this is good just to make sure that you're not passing along pathogens from one year to the next. And just to make sure that the pot is nice and clean before you put your plants in it. If necessary, you will need to drill some drainage holes. So if it's a pot that you're buying from the garden center that is specifically made for container planting, it will likely have holes in the bottom. But I have been surprised in the past. Sometimes you'll have an ornamental pot that's really not meant for container planting. So it doesn't actually have drainage holes at the bottom. You have to make sure that when you water, the water has a place to wash out of the pot, or else it's going to get really soggy and saturated in there. So make sure you drill your drainage holes like you see on the right-hand side. Loosely fill it with potting mix, and we'll talk about the type of potting mix you should use. But it's best not to scoop soil directly out of your garden or your yard and put it in a pot. Regular soil tends to be much too dense and heavy for containers, so you want a specific type of potting mix to put in these containers that's a little bit lighter and it drains a little bit easier. I like to water the mixture before planting. So it's nice if you have your soil in the pot already, you can just use a hose to put some water in there and you mix it up with your hand. You want it about the same texture as peanut butter or brownie batter, as someone I used to garden with used to say. So it should be about the same level of moisture as a sponge that you've wrung out in your hand. So not dripping with water, but moist. And this would be the time to add a little bit of slow release fertilizer if you want to. If you're purchasing a bagged potting mix, sometimes that will already contain some fertilizer, so it's just a matter of looking at the package. If you're doing a lot of containers, you may think about making your own potting mix. It's pretty simple, and it's a little bit more cost effective than buying the bagged product. And this is some form of peat moss or coconut coir, so some like organic material that lightens the potting mix, plus some screen finished compost, which provides some organic matter and some nutrients, and then vermiculite or perlite, which you can get at most garden centers and big box stores. But if that is too much work, there are lots of different types of potting mixes available. Some of them are organic, some of them have fertilizer built into them. So just take a look at the packaging to know what it is you're purchasing. But this, if you're only filling up a couple of pots, this is an easier way to go. And these are, again, available at hardware stores, garden centers, and big box stores. You can purchase them online as well. One neat trick that I've seen some gardeners use who enjoy container planting, especially if they're making really beautiful ornamental flower containers, is they will buy containers that they think are really beautiful, even if they're kind of the wrong size, if they're way too big. So for example, these containers here, which are very beautiful but very tall, and instead of filling the entire container up with potting mix, which could get kind of expensive, they actually will fill it most of the way or halfway with styrofoam or packing peanuts, or they'll use something like this, which kind of I think is also made of some type of styrofoam, which you can put at the bottom of the container and just take up some of that space, so you don't have to fill the entire thing with potting mix. So that's kind of a neat trick that I've seen some people use. Okay, and then it's time to plant. And so probably one of the easiest ways to get the garden going is just direct sowing your seeds right into the soil. This is recommended for any type of root vegetable like carrots, radishes, or beets that don't really tolerate being transplanted from one place to the other. Any Asian greens or mustard, arugula, lettuce can be direct sown. And then large seeded plants like spinach, peas, and beans, because the seeds are easy to handle and manipulate, and you can put them at the correct depth and at the correct spacing in your container. As many experienced gardeners know, some crop seeds are really, really tiny, and so it's hard to plant them at the right depth or at the right density. Sometimes you end up spilling the whole seed packet over your garden soil and wasting seeds. So that's a very easy way to plant. And the instructions for the planting, if you're direct sowing, everything's going to be on the back of the seed packet. And so that's the first place to look for information on how to plant, when you should be planting, how deep and far apart you should be planting, and also when you can expect that seed to germinate and start growing, and when you can expect to harvest. A mistake that I see a lot of new gardeners making is planting seeds too deep. They think that you have to plant it a couple of inches under the soil. In reality, you want to double the width of the seed, and that's your planting depth. So a seed that is 1/4 of an inch wide should only be planted about 1/2 inch deep. So that's a general rule. There are some crops that you don't even cover it with soil, you just press the seed into the soil surface. So it's really important to read the back of the seed packet for that information. Of course, another really easy way to start any sort of garden or container planting is just to purchase transplants. These are widely available right now at this time of season. They're even at grocery stores. McCaffrey's has a bunch of them, Whole Foods, but you can also go to nurseries and farmers markets to purchase these transplants. And that way you don't have to worry about starting the seeds. You choose the healthiest looking plants you can, and you've already kind of got your head start in your garden season. If you are purchasing transplants or you've started seeds indoors and it's time to plant outside, it's best to water the seedlings before you transplant, because transplanting can be a bit stressful for baby plants. If possible, transplant in the morning or on a day that is overcast. And you can put a scoop of compost in the planting hole as just a little bit of added nutrition for that little plant. Okay, so a little bit later in the season is when you'll have to start thinking about staking and support. And so for many container plants, especially ones that would generally vine all over the ground in a regular garden, they will need some sort of support. So these are some photos from one of our master gardeners who grew some cucumbers and zucchini and peppers and tomatoes in containers last summer. And so just a couple of examples of what some stakes and support systems will look like. So she has these kind of nice curved stakes here that she uses. For the peppers, she just has one straight stake that kind of supports the plant as it grows upward. And then for tomatoes, you could do the traditional tomato cage or a different type of staking. I think these are just kind of straight stakes. They're just kind of providing some general support for the plant. But what I wanted to point out with these photos is that these are cherry tomatoes, and we sometimes, think of cherry tomatoes as being small because the fruit is small, but the plant itself is pretty enormous in these photos. So just be aware that even small fruited vegetable crops can grow very large and wide. And so these do require some sort of staking so these plants don't fall over. Fertilizing the container garden, this is kind of a matter of preference. So one drawback maybe of planting in containers is that the plants have a finite amount of soil to draw nutrients from, whereas in a regular garden bed, they can continue to draw nutrients and water from a much larger volume of soil. So you may find that you have to use fertilizer in a way that you wouldn't necessarily in a regular garden bed. So a couple of different types that you could use. There are slow release fertilizers, which will release nutrients over a long period of time, kind of more slowly. This is the stuff that if you wanted to, you could mix into your potting mix when you're preparing your container, and that way it'll already be in the potting soil. But again, some potting mixes that you purchase at the garden center will already have some fertilizer mixed in, so you just have to read the package. And then some folks like to continue fertilizing at intervals of 2 to 4 weeks throughout the gardening season, and for that you could use a water soluble fertilizer like Miracle-Gro, and then you would just dilute that into your irrigation water according to whatever the package says. So it's important for these products and any fertilizer, any pesticide, to always follow the label instructions. And some plants need more fertility than others. So we have a term, heavy feeders, for those plants that tend to take up more nutrients throughout the growing season and can sometimes use a little boost. And so tomatoes are kind of a classic example. They usually grow very large. They're putting a lot of energy and resources into creating the tomato fruit. And so those will sometimes benefit from a little bit of supplemental feeding throughout the growing season. But things like asparagus, lettuce, radishes don't really need a whole lot of fertilizer. So those could probably do without the extra feeding throughout the summer. Watering is going to be a little bit different for container plantings if you're used to planting your garden right in the ground. For the same reason, really. So there's a finite amount of soil in that container, and it's also exposed to the sides of the pot where it's probably losing moisture. And so you might find that you have to water much more often for your container plants than you would for your normal garden plants. And so the best thing to do is just feel the potting mix with your finger, just a couple inches down, like this person is on the left-hand side. If it's still wet, a couple of inches down, then you don't have to water. But if it's dry, that's a good indication that you have to water. There are some types of pots that tend to lose more moisture than others. So if you're using a clay pot or a terracotta, which can look very beautiful for container plantings, those are more porous materials than something that has an enamel finish to it or something that's plastic. So those pots are going to dry out much faster than another type of pot. But on the flip side, because the soil is in a container, it is pretty easy to overwater as well. So if we get into kind of the cooler, more humid parts of the season, like spring and fall, you want to make sure you're not overwatering, because that can actually start to create some fungal or root rot issues for your plants. So it's kind of a delicate balance, but as the season starts to warm up and we get sunnier, hotter days, you'll find that you have to water more frequently. And other things to consider, the container size. So smaller containers are going to dry out much faster than larger containers. The amount of sun exposure, and also the surface that the containers are sitting on. So if it's a really hot patio and the containers are sitting directly on slate or concrete or cement, that warms up really fast. those pots are going to heat up faster and dry out as well. So something we might encourage if someone's planting on a hot patio is to put a pallet or some sort of material between the patio and the pot so that you're not getting that direct contact. And then a few just words of caution about containers in general. So if you have some large, heavy containers, they might be in one place for a while. And so they could stain wood or concrete over time because you're watering and there are nutrients and water and other materials sort of flushing out of the bottom of the container. And if you have a nice stained patio or porch or whatever it is, that can become discolored or stained over time. And another thing is that when filled with soil, a large container can weigh 100 pounds. And so don't think that just because it's in a container and this container has nice handles on it that you're going to be able to easily move these out of the way when you have company over and you want to use the porch for dinner, for example. So they are quite heavy and difficult to move. Another thing is if you're placing your containers on a balcony or other shared space, just be mindful that there will be water flushing out of the bottom. And so if you have a balcony kind of over another apartment or over your neighbor's balcony, they might get some of that water dripping on them. So just be mindful of those things as well. And I just have a couple of slides about growing herbs because this tends to be very popular. And so a lot of herbs can be grown indoors on the off season and then brought outside when it gets a little bit warmer. I had mentioned before, but most herbs will need full sun. So they'll need at least 6 hours of direct sun per day. So if you are growing in a window in your kitchen, it's best to place them in a south-facing window that has a lot of sun. There are some herbs that will grow in slightly lower light conditions. So mint and rosemary, thyme are a couple examples there. So if you don't quite have southern exposure or you don't have full sun, you can get away with growing some different types of herbs in the window. And then they can be put outside once the daytime temperatures get up to 65 or 70 degrees. So lots of people will put their containers of herbs outside for the growing season and then bring them back inside for the winter. The humidity and moisture requirements for different culinary herbs depend on the type of plant. And so I would just recommend knowing a little bit about the plant that you're growing so you know how often to water, whether it likes drier conditions or more humid conditions. And then fertilizing, you could fertilize every 2 weeks with a really low dose of a water-soluble fertilizer during periods of active growth, so when the plant is actually growing. But in general, herbs don't take up a whole lot of nutrients, so they're fairly easy to grow. And then when you see roots kind of poking out of the drainage hole, that's when you know it's time to repot to a slightly larger pot. And I just want to point out that lots of people try growing vegetables indoors. Herbs can do pretty well in southern exposure. Most vegetable crops will not do well if they are planted on a kitchen counter. There's just not enough light for those seedlings to develop properly, and so you'll get what we call leggy plants. They look like this, and if you've tried this before, you've probably seen this, but these plants are not getting enough light, so they're extending their stems. They're trying to find the light that they're not getting, and as a result, they end up being really spindly and weak, and they're not going to be very healthy plants. So if you do want to start seeds indoors or grow vegetables indoors, I would highly recommend getting supplemental light fixtures. And those could be fluorescent or LED lights, but most vegetables, it's just not bright enough indoors for them to grow properly. And I just wanted, before I wrap up, to point out a couple of great fact sheets that we have available. Again, you can search online for not just Rutgers, but any extension fact sheet that's a land-grant university-based resource. I recommend putting the word extension in your Google search to narrow down to extension resources. So you could put container gardening extension, and that way you'll be pointed towards these resources rather than, you know, somebody's garden blog, for example. So we have one specifically for container gardening with vegetables that you can search for. And a lot of the elements that I talked about today can apply to flowers and foliage plants as well. It's a lot of the same conditions. So once you know how to grow vegetables in containers, you can also create these really nice annual flower displays as well. So we do have another fact sheet on that topic as well. And just one more note before we wrap up is to consider donating your extra produce if you have some throughout the season, which many gardeners do end up with extra produce. You can check out ampleharvest.org, which is a great resource. You can put in your where you live, and it will give you a list of local food banks that will accept fresh produce. One of our close by food banks that does accept fresh produce is JFCS of Greater Mercer County. And so you can reach out to Beth at JFCS if you've got extra produce in the summertime. And most food pantries that will accept fresh produce absolutely love to get it. And so, you know, check out Ample Harvest, check out JFCS, and consider donating. And that's all I have for you tonight. So again, we are mostly working from home at this point. So if you stop by our office, chances are we won't be there. But the best way to reach me is through email. So I'll leave my email address up here. And then if you want just general gardening information that applies to Mercer County, I would suggest looking at the Master Gardener homepage, which has a lot of really great resources and information, and also has info on upcoming classes and webinars that we're offering through the Master Gardeners. And so, yeah, I think if there are questions, I would love to take some questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Margaret. That was really great. Really
Sure.
great. So we do have a lot of questions that came up and people put into the chat. So I will read them to you, and hopefully, I'm sure you'll be able to answer them. So the first question was, can people get copies of the PowerPoint?
Oh,
sure. So if you can send it to me, then we can provide it to the Office at the Jewish Center, and people can, I guess, request it from there, or we can send it out to everyone who is attending today. Maybe that's totally probably an easier way to do it.
Okay.
Okay. So next question from Sandy Rabinowitz is, what is a non-poisonous weed killer for an in-ground garden?
So I think rather than point you to a different product, we have a term in the horticulture world called integrated pest management. And that is basically using a combination of tactics to tackle whatever pest you have, whether it's an insect or a weed. And so usually for a lot of weeds in the vegetable garden, I never feel comfortable spraying anything, even if it's vinegar or another sort of natural product, just because you are working with food crops, and anything that you do spray in the vegetable garden should be treated like a pesticide. And so I always prefer to do hand pulling as much as possible. Mulching is really a great way to prevent a lot of weeds from popping up. So using grass clippings or dried leaves or straw around your plants can be a nice way of keeping weeds down, and just being really diligent about it. There are some organic herbicides out there. They tend to not be quite as effective as the chemical synthetic based ones. And again, just because it's organic or natural does not mean that it doesn't pose a threat to you or the insects, that beneficial insects or wildlife that we love in the garden. So it also depends on the type of weed. So you're welcome to email me and let me know what kind of weed problem you have, and I can sort of tailor my response to that.
Okay, thank you. Nancy Osborne asked, is zucchini or summer squash okay for containers?
Yes, it is. I would check out variety recommendations and try to look for varieties that are more compact, because those are plants that tend to vine. But I think I did show a couple of examples of those plants being grown in containers. And instead of vining along the ground, you might need to train them to grow a trellis or other type of stake or support.
Okay, next question is from Andrea Gaynor, and she wanted to know, how can you best grow lavender? It never seems to thrive for me.
Oh, I think lavender is probably clumped into the same group as a lot of culinary herbs. And so many of those need really well-drained soil. And so if you're trying to grow in an area that it gets waterlogged, or it just is not, if you have really clayey soil that holds onto water, it might kind of die out. So that's one possibility, is that the drainage isn't good enough. And probably full sun, I would think. Other than that, if there's some sort of underlying disease or pest issue, that might require a different type of tactic. But those are my general recommendations.
Heidi Joseph asks, what do you do with the dirt in the pots that you used last year?
So some people will reuse that. It's not, you don't necessarily have to throw all of it out. If you had any sort of disease issue, I would not recommend reusing potting soil. You might throw it in the woods, or it depends, I guess, how bad the disease issue was. You can also compost it if, you know, it just, you're ready to work with fresh potting soil and you want to change it out the following season. You could throw it in the compost bin or put it elsewhere in the garden. So it's kind of a matter of personal preference, but if you have had disease issues, I would not recommend reusing it. It's best to start fresh.
Okay. Sherry asks, if I keep the pots out in the garden or on the porch during the summer, which plants are worth bringing in and putting on a windowsill? And should I do something to the soil so I don't bring in bugs?
Yeah, so there are lots of plants that people like to bring indoors. They tend to be, you know, our tropical plants that we can treat as house plants or outdoor plants, depending on the time of year. And so again, a lot of those culinary herbs, like rosemary is an evergreen, so that will continue to live. It's a perennial. So yeah, things that are perennial, so they will survive until the next season. So basil is not going to really last throughout the winter. It's going to peter out after one growing season usually. And then in terms of not bringing bugs in, so I wouldn't be so concerned about the soil unless you had a really prominent insect issue, in which case there could be some, you know, some insects remaining that burrowed underground or something like that. But for house plants that people put outside and then bring back, we usually recommend that people just monitor them really well. So take a good look at the leaves, all of the stem surfaces, see if you see any little eggs or little caterpillars or flies or anything like that before you bring them inside, and try to treat whatever that pest issue is before bringing the plant inside. You can also bring it into kind of an intermediate place like your porch or your garage for a couple of days, just in case there's anything that sort of reacts to the warm conditions and becomes noticeable, then you'll know about it before bringing it into your kitchen or your living room.
That would be good.
Yeah.
Okay, from Ruth Lax, and maybe you sort of answered this question. Any concern about chemicals leaching from plastic or wood containers in the heat of the summer?
I'm not really concerned about that. So a lot of folks are concerned about building raised beds out of treated lumber. And from what I understand, they used to use a much more toxic treatment on lumber that was considered treated, pre-treated, that they've phased out. They no longer use that. So in general, we do recommend untreated wood, but the treated stuff is not as toxic as it used to be. I would be mindful of the type of material that your container is made out of. If you're worried at all, what you can do is buy a different container to kind of sit inside that container, or have some sort of liner on the side. We recommend that for raised beds if people are worried about some sort of chemical leaching off of the sides of the raised bed, but it's usually not an issue. And plants, generally they take up the elements that they need for growth. They don't take up the kind of extra elements that are in the soil. So for lead, for example, usually the issue is that there are particles of lead coming from a surface of a painted house or something and landing on the edible parts of the plant. It's not really that the plant is taking up lead out of the soil. So so those are some thoughts. I don't know if that answers it, but
okay. Andrea Gaynor wanted to know, how frequently should potted herbs be fed with Miracle-Gro, for example?
Yeah, that's also a matter of preference. You only really want to feed them while they're actively growing. Otherwise, the plant is not really taking that up. It's just going to be washed out through the water that you're using to water the plant. I would say, and herbs are not terribly heavy feeders, and so you could get away with just a nice rich potting mix and not really fertilizing. If you wanted the plant to grow bigger, or it's not growing as fast as you'd like, or if you start to see signs of nutrient deficiency like yellowing leaves, you could start with a very small dose of fertilizer and see how the plant reacts. But in general, herbs are pretty light feeders, and they don't need very frequent fertilizing.
Okay, here's a difficult question. How does one keep squirrels and other animals away from potted plants?
Ooh, yeah, we always get a question about some sort of animal. Usually it's deer. So for any sort of animal pest, similar to how we treat insect pests or weeds, we like an integrated approach. So usually multiple tactics kind of used at once is your best bet. For most pest animals, the best strategy is exclusion. So if you can, any sort of netting or fencing that you can use to protect your plants, or placing them in a place that is not accessible to squirrels or chipmunks or rabbits. An advantage of container planting is you can plant your garden on a balcony, or if you have a flat roof, on top of the roof, or in a really nice fenced in area. So yeah, netting, there are repellents out there for specific animals. My understanding is that most animals will get used to them after a while, and then they won't really care anymore. So you have to make sure that you're switching up the product every once in a while. And usually they're odor based, and so they don't always smell very good. But whatever it is, the animals will get used to them after a while and will kind of just go right past it and not care. And then it's just finding plants that they don't like as much, which is a little bit harder for a lot of gardeners to contend with. They want to grow what they want to grow. But if there is a certain plant that the squirrels or whatever it is keep getting at every single year, you might try to change up what you're growing. So if possible, fencing, netting, caging is really the best bet. It can be a little bit more expensive, but it can save you some animal grief down the road.
Okay. Next question is from Ruth Lax. She want to know, how long are packaged seeds good for?
That's a great question. Usually a couple of years. It depends how they're being stored. So in general, you want to store them in a cool, dry location, and they will last longer if they do. I have a bad habit of leaving my seeds in my car all throughout the gardening season, and that's definitely not good for their longevity. But another thing you can do is run a germination test on your seeds to figure out what percentage of your seeds are still vital. And you can do that by putting a couple of seeds, maybe 10 seeds, on a paper towel and spritzing them with water, and then putting that inside a Ziploc container and just waiting a couple of days and seeing what percentage out of those 10 have sprouted. And that's like a rough estimate of how good your germination rate is going to be. So if it's really low, like maybe 30%, you can either plan to plant more seeds so that you kind of make up for that, or it might be time to purchase new seeds. But usually you don't have to buy them every year. You can keep some seeds for multiple years.
Okay. Okay, from Bob Levine or Judy Levine, how do you keep mint from getting out of hand?
Ooh, that's a good reason to grow it in containers only, because it does, if you give it a garden bed, it will take over the whole garden bed if the conditions are right. So yeah, I would grow it in containers and keep it separate from your other plants.
Okay, and from Heidi, how do you keep insects from eating your veggies?
So that's kind of a loaded question, because most of the insects in the garden are not harmful, but I think most insects get a bad rap. And so a lot of gardeners are a little bit too quick to spray something. There are a couple of strategies. Again, I like the multi-strategy way of looking at it. It depends what the insect is the first thing. If it's something like aphids, which are a pretty ubiquitous garden pest, they can usually be washed off of the plant with water, sometimes sprayed with some soapy water, which will cause them to die. If you have some sort of pest that's like a worm, like a cabbage looper, or those tomato hornworms, often you can go out and hand pick them. If you don't have a billion of them, if it's a small number, you can hand pick them and drop them in a bucket of soapy water. The other strategy is to encourage beneficial insects in the garden by growing nice pollinator plants, by learning to recognize beneficial insects and know which insects are eating your plants and which ones are eating those insects. So things like lady beetles, both their larvae and the adult stage, they love eating aphids. Ground beetles are also really good predators in the garden, lacewings. So I would get to know the different types of insects, know who your enemy is and who your friends are, and then encourage the friends. And then the last thing is just that you might have to sort of raise your tolerance for damage in the garden. So if you see a little bit of nibbling here and there, it's not the end of the world. So I wouldn't pull out, the pesticide at that stage. So that is a part of gardening.
So this is a totally different type of request, but can you shut down the slideshow so everybody can just see you speaking? There is a way for each individual to set that up, but perhaps they didn't do that. Okay, and now let me see if I can highlight you, spotlight for everyone. There you go. Okay, next question is, whoops. Next question is, I think this is the next question. What do you think of the new type of canvas bags or pots, canvas bag pots?
We have had some questions about them. I don't have any personal experience with them, so I don't really know. I think I could imagine that they might hold on to water a little bit better than like a clay pot. And I know that lots of people like growing potatoes in bags. But other than that, yeah, I actually don't have much experience with those. It seems to be kind of a new trend that hasn't quite hit us yet. So I'm not quite sure.
Okay, we have quite a few more questions. I'm going to take them. But if people need to get off, they can, of course, leave on their own. Are heirloom tomatoes more susceptible to aphids? From Andrea Gaynor.
Not that I know of. I don't think aphids care whether they're heirlooms or not. Yeah, they like all sorts of garden plants, and so I don't think it has to do with it being heirloom or not.
Okay. Well, actually, the rest of the comments aren't really questions, they're thank yous. This was excellent. Thanks so much. Great program. Thanks, Margaret, for providing so much information in a short amount of time. Thank you, Margaret. And we do thank you, Margaret. Thanks for doing this. And it was very informative. It was great. Thanks, Mike, for introducing us to Margaret. And Margaret may come back next year in the fall to do something on harvesting your garden. But we'll see. That's for the future Arts and Culture Committee to take up. So I know it will be popular and much appreciated. And to everyone who came, thank you so much for coming. And we will get the slides out to everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll send those.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Excellent. Very
Thank you.
informative. Can't wait to plant.
Good. I'm glad.
And thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Great.